and welcome back to the Master Engineer podcast. I am, as always, your host, Zotak Andrei. You're listening to episode 32, in which I am welcoming back Lyle McDonald for the continuation of episode 30, which was mostly about the energy in component of diets. And in this one, we talk about the other side of the coin, so to speak, which is the energy out component. And we mainly contrasted Adam Levine's N.E.A.T or non-exercise activity thermogenesis with Herman Pontzer's constrained energy expenditure model. Basically, the whole episode is a long discussion between us. Lyle went over the components of energy expenditure and sort of we discussed all of them. And then we sort of discussed the realities surrounding energy expenditure and how much activity people do get or can get in each day and so on and so forth. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it valuable. And without further ado, let's hear Mr. Lyle McDonald. Okay, so it seems like a great segue to talk about N.E.A.T because there are two kind of concepts that kind of seem to butt head with each other. So on one end, we have James Levine's N.E.A.T, and on the other hand, we have Herman Pontzer's constrained energy expenditure model. I don't know, have you heard of that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so like basically Levine's is I don't know, theory or construct is that, you know, you move more, you burn more calories, and that explains why you can remain leaner, maintain higher calories and that kind of stuff. And Herman's Pontzer's model is basically says that, you know, after a certain while your body will kind of just adapt and somehow reduce the calorie burn, become more efficient basically, and we reduce it some other way. And and I recommend to the listeners to check out his interview with Danny Lennon on the Sigma Nutrition.
I mean, Levine invented N.E.A.T. Like, he was the first paper that did it and gave it that. Really, unfortunately, like, scientists have decided to become comedians, and I'm really tired of it. And he was just like, resistance to obesity, a neat explanation. Just like, oh, for goodness sake. Like, really? Jesus, good God. And now every scientist wants to be a comedian, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, and Pontzer, Danny asked him about this, and he was like, who knows, maybe we don't, like, we have this idea that, you know, we have resting energy expenditure and thermic effect of feeding, and then physical activity, and then N.E.A.T, and that's it. He said that maybe there's a fifth component, who knows? And I'm just curious, because, like you mentioned, step counts, and, like, I work in a gym, and like that means an 8-hour shift, and sometimes I come back in the afternoons or in the early morning to train clients. So my average is 20,000.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So, and I'm almost 90 kilos. And for the past month, like, I've been maintaining my weight, and I track my calories now. I'm not 100% obsessive, but let's say I'm 10% off, which I don't think I'm more than that. Let's say I have been eating 3,700 calories. I mean, at almost 200 pounds, 5 days of training, 20,000 steps, you know, that I should still be in a deficit. I mean, and of those calories, a bunch of that was protein, which, like, I was over 300 grams of protein each day. In theory, should burn off, or at least a certain amount of calories should have been burned off as.
The numbers are, I mean, that's 18 calories a pound. That's reasonable. I mean, like I said, to get to 20 calories a pound, consistent daily energy expenditure, like that takes some work. Like, I know step count really does add up, but there is also the adaptations, and I think that's kind of what we're getting at. So just for, okay, so quick preface. And actually, we never really did kind of get back to the idea of alternating maintenance for as long a period of time as you diet. And I think there's some legitimacy to that, right, of dieting down in stages. But now we're looking at, I mean, if someone's going to use that for contest prep, what are they starting, a year and a half out? Or was that just not a contest prep? And I do think to a degree, like, oh, I'm going to diet down to 10 and I'm going to go immediately into bulk. No. You need to settle down for a few weeks or longer. And I've written about maintenance stuff on my site for both directions. Oh, I've gained a bunch of muscle. I'm going to go straight back into dieting. No. Adaptation does not end the day you stop training hard, right? Give it a few weeks, right? You can maybe clean, whatever. Wait, there's no rush. You don't have to start diet right back down, and there seems to be proportionally more muscle loss. Same. So I agree with it in concept, certainly. I don't know that you have to do an equal amount, right? We know that most of the metabolic adaptations are fixed at 2 weeks. There may be benefits in terms of, there might be other long-term benefits. Set point doesn't ever seem to really change. Gives you a chance to get your training ramped back up. It probably gives you a psychological chance to kind of learn to maintain at that level, if that makes any sense. Right? A lot of people diet straight down, and I got to 7% once, and I must have held it for 3 days before I went off my diet, and it all went wrong again. Like I was so hungry, and like I think in that sense. And if you're trying to, if you're a dude and you're 20%, diet down to 15, hang out there for a couple months, train hard, diet down to 10 to 12, stay there for a while. I think you mentioned, like I said, names, someone earlier in the podcast who does a 16-week prep. I bet he starts out proportionally leaner than most, right? That's really the issue. The drug guys who did 12-week preps, one, they had drugs, and once you could throw thyroid clen and everything else at it, none of this matters. Duchesne once wrote, you can lose 20 pounds of fat in 12 weeks with the right drugs if you diet hard enough. For a natural, as we both know, everybody thinks they're leaner than they are. Go on to any forum online. Oh, you're 16% body fat for a woman. No, you're not. You're about 24. And that leads to a lot of disappointments on contest day, right? But if you've got a male who's naturally holding 10 to 12%, who is kind of in the, who doesn't see a lot of metabolic slowdown, who really knows how to diet properly, I can believe a 16-week straight prep will work. I don't think for the majority it will work. Right? And I think that's the difference. We look at the exceptions and go, oh, well, he pulls it off. Right, but he's by definition the guy that did pull it off, and he knows what he's doing. Especially your first couple of run-throughs, you don't. And my rule of thumb is however long you think it's going to take you to get there, double that. And if we double 16 to 32, you got just over 6 months. Anyway, okay, that was that. So I agree in premise. I don't know if I would take it to quite that extreme, but whatever. We're picking nits. Whether you stay there for 8 weeks or 16 to maintain and get used to that body fat, this is, like I said, this isn't a race. All right, so energy expenditure. 4 primary components other than the mystical fifth that apparently Pontzer has invoked that, I'll come back to that. I think that's a cop-out. We would have known about it by now, right? When we can measure calorie expenditure in a metabolic chamber to the calorie, there's not some magical fifth component we've been missing. I'm sorry. Anyway, resting metabolic rate, number of calories you burn totally at rest, represents basically it's your baseline energy expenditure. It takes calories to keep your brain working, muscles maintaining tone, heart beating, sitting up while you get bored while I talk. Like all of that takes calories, and that's resting metabolic rate. It's mostly related to lean body mass. There is a component, like body fat does burn calories. People forget about this. And it actually, 2-3 pounds of fat burns as many calories as a pound of muscle at rest. So honestly, if you want to raise your metabolic rate, just gaining muscle's hard. Gaining fat's easy. Right? And if you're heavier, you burn more calories moving around. So, like, double win. And yes, I'm kidding. But and muscle just doesn't burn that many calories at rest. It's about 6 calories per pound. It's about 13 calories per
6,
kg. Everyone's like, gain muscle to raise metabolism. No. If you gain 10 pounds of muscle, that's 60 calories a day extra. Like, if you gain an absolute pile, right? If you gain 40 pounds of muscle, 18 kilos over a career, yes, that's significant. That is how many years of consistent hard training with a little bit of luck, right? Women might gain 20 if they're lucky. That's 120 calories a day. Yes, does it add up? Is that about 1,000 calories a week? Sure, but we're talking about 3 years of brutal, intensive training. And several studies have shown that over 5 to 6 months, men's metabolic, like if you train men and women, men's metabolic rate will go up by like 50 or 60 calories. And most of that is not due to the muscle mass. It's actually due to other factors. Women, 0. They gain like 3 or 4 pounds of muscle. Hooray, you're burning 25 more calories a day. Right? It's insignificant in the short term, and it's pretty insignificant in the long term unless you're talking about big dudes. So really gaining muscle is a dead end street to raising metabolic rate. Like the 60 calories a day, just go walk in the treadmill for 10 minutes and you've caught that up, right? There is not as much variation in resting metabolic. Like people talk about a slow metabolism, and this is basically a myth. Like, yeah, if you're hypothyroidal, clinically, there's an effect. There's certain disease states, but by and large, like you don't see people, and actually, people don't want to hear this, the heavier you get, your resting metabolic rate goes up. Not the other way around, right? This is provably false that there's such a thing as a slow metabolic rate. That doesn't mean there's not a low total energy expenditure, but I'll come back to that. So resting metabolic rate, it goes down when you diet because you're smaller and for adaptive reasons. This whole idea you cannot build metabolic capacity by that's just a bunch. It doesn't work that way. Like, I mean, there's studies, like we overfed them by 1,000 calories a day. And at the end of 8 weeks, the resting metabolic rate had gone up 100 calories. Right, and they gained 5 kilos of body fat. So how is that helpful? Right? like yes, the resting metabolic rate went up because they're bigger. So the second one is the thermic effect of food. These are the calories you burn from digesting and metabolizing food. Normal diet, it's about 10% of total calories, so it's really not that much, right? On 2,000 calories, it's about 200 calories. Higher protein diets, it's about 15%. It is a little bit higher. You generally have to replace a lot of carbs or fat with a lot of protein.
Like I've seen even 20 to 30% in some studies.
Sorry. I'm not talking about for the individual nutrients. I'm talking about the rough estimate for your total diet.
Oh, okay.
Right, so thermic effective fat is about 3%. Thermic effective carbs is about 6%. So there's like, oh, if you switch fat out for carbs, you burn more calories. Yeah, 3 calories for every 100 that you switched out. You'll be ripped in 2 decades. Protein, you'll see between 15 and 25%, depending on the protein source and the form and a bunch of other stuff. But if you average that out for the standard diet, it's about 10% for the overall diet. That's where that 10% comes from. So like if you're looking at someone eating, 15% protein and 60, like it's about 10% total. If you raise protein to 25 or 30%, like an athletic diet, the average will come up to about 15% of your total calories. Now, that does add up, right? So if you're on 3,000 calories a day and high protein, that 15%, like that could conceivably up to 450 calories extra burned per day.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying. Like some days, half of my calorie intake was from protein, like 400 grams of protein and like 30-ish, 30 calories.
And that might be another thing that Duchesne was seeing, right? This was in early days. He was just going, oh, their total energy expenditure is enormous, right? And they're eating 400 grams of protein a day because they get free supplements. So, and when you diet, it doesn't really come down that much. Like, oh, I took 500 calories out of my diet. Yeah, your TF went down by 50. Like it automatically reduces the deficit, but it's not that significant. Thermic effective activity, that's formal exercise. And we might quibble over how is brisk walking through the office formal exercise? Probably not. But is brisk walking on a treadmill therefore not formal exercise? I don't know. And I don't know what the current definitions, if you're walking at 3 miles an hour, like we have walking treadmills. If you're walking at 2.5 miles an hour on a walking treadmill at work, well, is that neat? Is that formal exercise?
Yeah, it's probably any activity you go out of your way to perform deliberately.
I think it probably makes more sense to define it in terms of intensity, but like I said, I haven't kept up with
voluntary physical activity.
Yeah, it's stuff that you consciously go out of your way to do. So anyway, that can vary, right? That can vary from 0 if someone is inactive to enormous if someone is doing, again, if you're a Tour de France cyclist, on certain stages, you may be burning 6,000 to 8,000 calories in a day. Most people, if they're on an exercise program, it's somewhere between those two. And exercise does not burn nearly the calories people wish it did. It's really disappointingly low for anything but the most high volume, high intensity activity, right? People do these aerobics classes. I must have burnt 900 calories. Try 350. If you're lucky. Oh, well, I did interval training. I must have burned. Well, the afterburn doesn't amount to jack squat. And 20-minute workout. I got bad news for you. Maybe 150, 200 calories if you're lucky. Like it's just really not there unless you're doing hours. Go be an endurance cyclist, man. You can eat anything. When you're doing a 5-hour bike ride twice a week, you're burning at least 2,000 to 3,000 calories in that workout alone. Weight training burns, it's terrible. The numbers are just awful. Like, it's something like 2 calories a pound per hour, right? So if you're doing, if you're a 200-pound dude and you're doing, a pretty, more of a bodybuilding workout, like powerlifting and Olympic lifting is even worse because you sit on your butt most of the time. You might be burning 350, 400. If you're a small female at 120 pounds, that hour of weight training, if you're lucky, 2 to 250.
Yeah, especially if it's the banded body weight, banded kind of.
Yeah, like if you're training hard, it's a little bit higher, but it's just not that much. And again, does it add up over time? Sure. 200 extra calories a day is 1,400 a week, which is, about 30, it's about a pound every third week. But it's just not that significant unless you can do a lot of it. And by definition, like, it's funny, right? Endurance athletes who are generally lean are the ones that can do the most activity, and they generally don't need to, right? They don't have to worry about body fat percentage by and large. It's the people, and it's usually only trained athletes. The average overweight, unfit beginner, they can't burn jack squat during exercise, and they're the ones that need to, at least not for a while. Like, it can take months.
I have to get somehow Corey Pico on the podcast and ask him, like, he's a strength and conditioning coach for like elite UFC guys like Kamaru Usman and stuff. Like, I have to ask him, how many hours do these guys train? Like, I would bet it's like 4 hours a day, like maybe even more. The amount of and the types of workouts they must combine must be insane.
Oh yeah, like, when you're looking at guys training those 4 or 5 hours a day, when it's a lot of metabolic work. Like, as an example, right, I did ice speed skating. I trained easily 4 to 5 hours a day, but you burn nothing on the ice, right? Here was a typical sprint workout for me. I would show up, I'd do a 45-minute warm-up. In 2 hours on the ice, we would do like a 5-lap warm-up, which is about 2 minutes. We would do standing starts, which is about 30 meters. We would do some increasing. We'd maybe 10 of those. What does that burn? Maybe 20 calories if you're lucky. We would do some progressive speed work, and then we would do 4 by 400 meters, which is about 30 seconds on a 10-minute rest, and then we would do a 5-lap cool down. So in 2 hours on the ice, maybe 20 minutes worth of total work, maybe. And you're cold, so you get hungry. Then I would do a 45. Like, I burned more calories sitting on the bike, warming up and cooling down, than I did on the ice. But that was that. Sprinters are the same way. They sprint 30 meters and rest 3 minutes. In 2 hours, they get less than nothing done. They actually burn their calories with low-intensity metabolic work on easy days. But some sports, right, if you're doing 2 hours of sparring and technique work and you're doing an hour of metabolic work, an hour of weight training a day, sure, you can get absolutely a lot of calories. But for most people, it's just not going to happen. And that's the sad reality. And that brings us the long way to N.E.A.T, right? Non-exercise activity thermogenesis, as defined by Levine. You'll also hear it referred to as spontaneous physical activity, and that's not, it describes a different thing, right? So originally what N.E.A.T was thought to be was sort of these unconscious activities that some people engage in, right? In Levine's original study, he put people in a metabolic ward, so no exercise. He gave them 1,000 calories extra a day, and the fat gains range from very little, a couple of kilos, up to like 7 kilos or 8 kilos or something. And, right? And of course, a lot of people back, and they were like, see, energy balance doesn't work. And I'm like, see, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand energy balance. It's not just calories in. What happened was their calories out went up, right? And it was all through, some people fidgeted, right? We all knew that guy in school whose leg was always bouncing and always, right? They would stand up and sit back down. They would just go do these activities. And when they mathed it out, right, some people had this unconscious activity would go up by like 700 calories a day. So their true surplus was only 300. And that's enormous, right? So originally they thought it was just this unconscious stuff. And it's hugely genetic. There's this huge variation. Of course, by definition, if it's unconscious, it's unconscious. So it doesn't really do you any good, right? You cannot consciously engage in fidgeting for very long. But then they started to redefine it to include these spontaneous activities these activities that occur just in day-to-day life that are not formal exercise but are not unconscious. And the easiest example is like taking the stairs instead of the elevator, parking further away from the store so you have to walk. This is where step counting came from. This is where like all this stuff came out of a lot of that. Gardening. There's all kinds of activities you can do that occur during the day, right? If you want to get ridiculous, and this shows you how old I am, back in the day, we didn't have remote controls on the TV. I'm talking way back in the day, right? You had to physically get up, go.
I know.
Yeah, go flip it. Well, there's some people listening to this that think I'm kidding. They use their PlayStation, they use their Fire Stick controller to change the channel and all this stuff, right? So just having to get up and if you were the kid, your parents told you to go change the channel. If you were a younger sibling, your older brother told you to go do it, right? You didn't have a choice in this matter. So through whatever you were having to get, like, was it burning a lot? No, but that's kind of an example of what this is. And people that work a job where they're on their feet all the time, right? I guarantee if you look at the NEAT of someone who works at department stores, in as much as they exist, a Home Depot, which is like, that's a construction store here in the U.S., stores like that, they're on their feet for 8 hours. They are burning through NEAT far more calories.
I'm in the same way in the gym.
Right, and that's Sumi is the same way. She's in the gym most hours. She's in the gym with me. She's got stuff going on. She walks her child to school. Like, all this adds up over time, and it can add up to very significant numbers. And what you find is that, okay, resting metabolic rate, not a lot of variance from people at the same body weight. Thermic effective food, meh. Thermic effective exercise can be enormous if you're talking about active individuals. NEAT, between any two people, can vary 2,000 calories from highest to lowest, right? There is no slow metabolism. There is a low NEAT level, right? That's the thing. Yes, the overall total daily energy expenditure is lower, but it's not in the metabolic rate component, resting metabolic rate component. It's not in the food component. If they're not doing any exercise, obviously that's low, but it's in the NEAT component. And when they've done some cross-sectional, some comparative work, right, the more modernized the country is, the less NEAT. And this has been a refrain for a while. Women back in the 60s and 70s, those vacuum cleaners were monsters, right? These were 50 pounds. Women used to tear rotator cuffs with these things. Doing just general housework burned a ton of calories. We don't hand wash dishes anymore. We don't, all that stuff. We've got a Roomba.
Yeah, I do. Dishes do, but a couple of years ago, my washing machine broke, and I had to wash my socks for 15 minutes.
It's hard.
I was surprised. Yeah,
it's hard work. A trainee I knew years ago, we would track her. It was the Body Bug, an early version of this. Weight training burned nothing. She once gardened for 3 hours. She burned 650 calories. Right? Stuff like that. And so it really adds up. And so if you look at less modernized, third world countries, NEAT is much higher because they can't drive everywhere. They can't just go, have stuff delivered by them. They're having to go do stuff. I believe the UK and America is about the same. In one country that I forget, women is higher than the men's because not only are the women expected to work in the fields, they're expected to do the housework. So they get doubled up on. And this stuff is really, really, really enormous. And that's where the big variations come from. So that's kind of, and more than that, it doesn't feel like formal exercise. The intensity is much lower, right? Walking on a walking treadmill, which go about 2.5 miles an hour because you have to be able to work, you don't even feel that. Right, that is such a low pace. You will not even think. But if you go to the gym and try to do an hour at even a moderate intensity, one, you're exercising, so you get bored.
Exactly.
Right? How many machines and exercise classes exist? We've got TV, video games, this and that and the other, simply to keep people from going crazy. But if you're on a treadmill and you're working, and suddenly, wow, I just walked for an hour, it doesn't feel like formal exercise. And there is a lot of potential there to get people increasing their energy expenditure without feeling. It's like when you trick people into eating less. They don't feel like they're dieting, but they are. And it's kind of, I'm going to hate myself for this. It's a neat trick if you could pull it off. Okay, sorry, that's terrible. And okay, so that's the one side, right? And this is really, and I think there's ways to do it. People who put on step counters and stuff are often shocked by either how low or how high it is.
Yeah, usually it's low. Huh.
Usually it's low, but even that is informative, right? That tells you, okay, this is, and there's also an interesting thing, right? We know that as people diet and get leaner, often their activity and their NEAT goes down. It's part of the adaptation, right? They get tireder. And although there's an interesting data set in anorexia in certain starvation models, there's a hyperactivity that is part of the problem, but that's a whole separate thing. But as people get heavier, often their activity, even though they would be burning more calories in activity because they're bigger, their activity goes way down because it's harder to move a bigger body. And you frequently see that as they lose weight, their NEAT goes up, at least transiently, because suddenly it's easier to do things, and that has kind of a benefit. And even going back to the exercise thing, right? We've known for years, we put people on an exercise program, they don't really lose the amount of weight you'd predict. Aha, energy balance doesn't work. No, there's just changes elsewhere. Stop being dumb. One of the things is people often eat more. That's highly variable, whether consciously or unconsciously. But some studies show that NEAT goes down to compensate. And I think this comes back to, leads into the Pontzer model. But usually it's in older folks or when you throw beginners into very hard exercise. And one of the studies I cited in the women's book, they took overweight individuals and they either did 300 calories of exercise or 600 calories of exercise. They did it all out, and what they found is they all lost about the same amount of weight. When they did, however they did it, the guys that did the 600 calories of exercise immediately went home and were tired, and their NEAT went down by 300. So it balanced out. Now, there's a couple things to take from this, is that one, there can be a constraint. Two, this is a good reason for beginners to do less than more, right? Like, why do double the hard work in the gym that you hate for the same response? I do think, and I'm not sure if the research has shown this, like as people get fitter, that gets better. But even there, right? Look, I've done interval training for more decades than I care to think about. I don't do it anymore. You get tired, right? If you are training hard and you go bust your butt for however long, you're going to sit around more later in the day. And this happens with lean dieters, like physique dieters. They're exhausted all the time. Even if they're training, great. That may not be changing, although they're smaller, etc. But they may go home and lay around all day because they're exhausted. So suddenly their expected deficit is not their real deficit. And this can happen at the beginning stages too.
That's why I hate these idiot trainers who are doing like you know. In the sense, I like people who aren't trained, because sometimes I have clients who come to me from other trainers and they're like, so 2 minutes of rest. What, 2 minutes? The other guy told me 30 seconds. And I'm like, oh my goodness, okay. So like, I hate those trainers where the entire goal of the workout is to get people tired, which is awesome. And they get tired and then they go home and just are useless for the rest of the day.
Exactly. And if you build up and start slowly, that is avoided, right? There's another paper I looked at, and it was looking at something else, gender differences in fat and weight loss, but it took about 6 months to build them up from about 100 calories a day of exercise to 600, right? And this goes back, I mentioned typically exercise doesn't burn a lot of calories for beginners initially, right? As you get fitter and progress and work a little bit harder and can do more, over time, this will increase, right? So there's 2 or 3 month studies that are like, yeah, people walk for 30 minutes 3 times a week and the weight didn't fall off. Well, gee, when you're only burning 100 calories 3 times a week, I'm shocked. But, in 6 months, as your fitness improves, that it gets better because you can handle more work. And if you do it gradually enough, you're never sore, you're never exhausted, you never completely hate what you're doing. But even there, some researchers, I think Levine himself has said, increasing NEAT, it probably has the potential to burn more calories than formal exercise, right? So you go to the gym for an hour and you do a moderate intensity workout and you burn 300 calories, maybe 5 calories a minute if you're lucky. 10 if you can work pretty hard, but that's working, and most beginners can't do that, right? If you're in a situation, let's say you work an 8-hour shift and you can find a way, and normally sitting you burn about a calorie a minute. If with a walking treadmill or moving, if you can increase that to 2 calories a minute, let's say for even half the day, right, 4 hours, Suddenly you're burning an extra 60 calories an hour, an extra 240 calories that day. You've burned almost the same amount as in an hour of exercise that you probably hated and were bored doing without thinking about it. If you can do that for 8 hours a day, you've now burned 480 extra calories just by increasing your calorie output by 1 calorie a minute. And I'm not saying that these numbers are made up. I'm just trying to kind of make the point. You've now burned 480 calories extra a day and never noticed. You didn't have to go to the gym and suffer for an hour and be bored and be miserable because you didn't. And that's where N.E.A.T has really, I think, the potential to have, and that's what the researchers are kind of saying. And back to the step counter, and then I'll move on. A lot of people, I think, when they see those numbers, it turns into a game, and they go, "Well, I want to beat that." And I think gamification of a lot of this is the future. Although, wasn't there a study that showed that step counters made people neurotic? Or thought I saw somebody mention this recently.
It was something. I think Andy Galpin shared this too. That after a point, people just don't care. Like it's exciting initially, then it kind of just dies. Like the Pokemon Go phenomenon.
Yeah, but that's true of everything. I mean, to dismiss a potentially useful tool, to me, that's kind of throwing the baby out with the bath. And I think we're going to come up with better things, right? I've heard of.
I think it's a huge personality thing.
Sure.
Less conscious people just don't care or whatever. They're just not wired that way.
And I mean, people forget, right? Humans, we evolved, or I hate to say design, like we evolved to be opportunistic, right? In the ancient world, going out of your way to do extra activity was not really the bright thing to do, right? Burning extra, like people laugh, humans now run for entertainment. Back in the day, you ran to run down an animal and then sat around as much as humanly possible because to exercise, the Kenyan runners are hilarious. When they retire, they don't run. Running for leisure, they think that's asinine, and it probably is. But it's what we have to do in the modern environment.
Yeah, and we used to play sports for the sake of playing them.
But that's my grandmother thought gyms were ridiculous. She gardened 3 hours a day and stayed fit. And yes, gyms are ridiculous. However, in the modern world, those are pretty much our only options. Like, I mean, it's different now. You can go do outside stuff and that kind of whatever. But like, that's the only way for the general public to is to do formal exercise or find a way to increase N.E.A.T. And I think a lot of this gamification, we're gonna, people like immediate rewards. They like. Facebook is great at firing off the reward system when you get notifications. That sort of thing. There's a video game podcast I used to listen to, and one of the guys wanted to get in shape. And he downloaded a role-playing game that would have him enter his exercise, and that's how he leveled up his character. And for him, the game was the important bit. Now, yeah, could you cheat? Could you lie? Sure, but why? Like, why would you bother? Right? I'm sure, I don't... Just go play a role-playing game if you're going to lie to your program. But, not fit days, some of the stuff where people would put out their workout numbers and you're like, you get competitive and yada, yada, yada. I do think there's going to be some interesting things coming out of there. But so like I said, if you do a ton of exercise, your body adapts. This leads us to the Pontzer model. So, so for people listening, what he's basically saying is that, okay, and you kind of described this, is that when you start to try to increase your activity, eventually the body senses and it's sensing it hormonally, and there's a lot of physiological signals, and our hypothalamus is constantly integrating these signals. So the general idea, and this is his graphic that I will try to describe, right? So he's got total energy expenditure on the y-axis and the general idea is, the more activity you do, the more calories you burn, right? It's additive. And then his model says, okay, as you add activity, it goes up for a while, but then it levels off because as you add physical activity, the body adapts in other ways.
So they did some studies on hunter-gatherers, and they did double-labeled water. So
I've seen those. The studies that claim that we do the exact same amount of activity as they do, and yeah, I find that excruciatingly hard to believe. And till I see some pretty strong evidence, I'm not convinced. Okay, seriously, why can I not find this? So yeah, and like I said, I already mentioned a study that showed that when people tried to add too much activity, things went, the body adjusted N.E.A.T because people were tired. Now, in his little graphic, he just lists energy expenditure is other. He's got physical activity and then other. And I think he's assuming that, okay, if you add physical activity, the other could be resting metabolic rate. Well, it doesn't really show that that's the case. And thermic effect food is not going to change because you're doing more physical activity. The problem is that now, and what I can't tell from this paper, is he considering physical activity only formal exercise, or is he also considering that as NEAT?
In the papers he mentioned, like in hunter-gatherers, basically his point, what even though they are like, I don't know, walking for hours a day, they are still somehow expending just as many calories as a quote-unquote more sedentary.
Yeah, like I said, I actually find, you can criticize me for dismissing a paper out of hand, but I don't buy it for a damn second. I do not buy that the average person who works at a cubicle, who goes home and watches TV, is walking anywhere close to the amount of a hunter-gatherer on an average day. I don't buy that for a second at face value. I think we're getting into, and I'd have to read the papers, I think we're getting into enormous problems with self-estimation of activity. Doubly labeled water is I mean, it's possible that the hunter-gatherers, that's absolutely the case. But I think, I like I said, unless they did doubly labeled water with the average individual, said, I'm not buying it.
So it says in the paper, quote, people in less socioeconomically developed populations, including subsistence farmers and traditional hunter-gatherers, have total energy expenditure similar to those in more developed populations, despite substantial differences in physical activity. Now, it's a pretty broad description.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not convinced that I buy it. Like, and even if you look at his original editorial, and this was several years ago, he did posit a couple things that I don't know if they've been examined. One, he pointed out that with conscious effort, and this is I think part of the key. With conscious effort, clearly we can overcome this. We know this for a fact because athletes do it all the time, right? If we consciously decide or put the effort into increasing our NE-AT, right? What I think he is looking at, and I might buy this at face value, is that it's like with diet, it's like with the food thing. Right? We know that left to their own, if people exercise, they will just frequently eat more because they are not, but if they consciously control their diet, suddenly exercise works a lot more effectively. If you are simply, okay, this is my daily activity and I'm not going to think about it beyond what I have to do for work, I can buy that the body probably adapts. You go home, you're tired because you've done a lot of work. Then you get people that are forced into that environment, like you. I had a guy this years ago, I got in a fight on my Facebook group because he was like, I don't agree that overweight people can't exercise enough. When I was 15, I worked at a hardware store and was forced to be on my feet for it. Right, you were not formal. Dude, you didn't have a choice, right? This is such a terrible comparison. You had to be on your feet 8 hours. You lost your job and couldn't afford anything, right? This is not what I'm talking about. And he could never see that he was just this weird.
And I am transparent about it. Sorry, like I have people messaging me like, "How do you get your steps? How do I get mine more? Because I don't have time in the day." And I'm like, "Okay, but I'm sorry. Like I don't go out of my way to get these steps, and I just simply do my job, and this is how much I get in a day."
Right. And I think what even Pontzer would, and again, then he also talked about the Tour de France guys and high-level athletes. He's like, clearly for short periods of time, if you're doing an absolute metric pile of exercise and you're fit, which I already talked about, you can surpass this. Now, admittedly, they don't do this forever, but obviously athletes burn thousands of calories a day. So it could be that because they're fit, their NE-AT doesn't go down. Well, I mean, they probably do go home and sit around, but it doesn't matter. If you're training 4 to 5 hours hard a day and you are burning several thousand calories, it doesn't matter if your NE-AT goes down by 500. You are still in a 4,000 calorie deficit, right? But it is balancing demands. I said, maybe if you do 600 hard calories, you offset it by 300. But even with that, your total energy expenditure still went up. It's still above where it would be. And I don't think his model is kind of looking at, well, if daily activity, whatever, that's not consciously driven goes up, it may adapt. But even then, it only adapted to a certain point. Right, even his own graphic goes, it goes up for a while. Because, if if you work manual labor, right, you're burning a ton of calories. I had a friend who did construction in the winter. It's like, you could eat anything. fine. But if you're working 8 hours of manual labor in the cold and burning 4,000 calories, and you get home and you rest a little more from 5 to 9 p.m., you're still burning more. It may be constrained within a certain point, above a certain point, but to a degree. He also posited, and I think this is the more interesting thing, there may be a genetic set point for this. And I don't know if he's pursued this. Like, this was in his original editorial when he first conceptualized this. That this might partly explain why some people, when they add exercise or increase NEAT, don't see this big shift. They don't see this big adaptation. Maybe they have a set point for a higher constrained level of activity than someone who gets tireder and does have a lower NEAT, unless they very consciously. Like I said, that would be an interesting one to pursue, because it would make a lot of sense within the context of other things that we know, right? We know that people differ in their response to overfeeding, their response to dieting in terms of how much metabolic rate goes up or goes down. And some people are just genetically screwed. If you look at that, the people who get the biggest metabolic rate boost with overfeeding get the lowest when they diet. It's harder for them to put on weight, and then the other people are switched. And it wouldn't surprise me at all, because too much of this is related. It's driven by dopamine signaling, which is not only a reward pathway. That's old paper talked about the neurochemical determinants of NEAT and even enjoyment of exercise. And dopamine signaling is a big one. So if you've got a dopamine pathway, it may be screwed up 6 different ways that may make palatable foods more palatable, may make you less likely to enjoy exercise or less likely to engage in voluntary NEAT or whatever it is. So some people, and those of us who are active, always forget that. We forget that we enjoy activity. Sometimes we love this stuff. We are not, and unfortunately we train the people by and large that aren't like that. And I think a lot of trainers have no concept. I love training. Yeah, but you wanted to be in the gym suffering since you were 15. If you're a dude or whatever, right? I love training. I love being macro-obsessive, psychotic, right? Your clients don't. And you can't treat them like they do. Because if you do, you'll chase them out, and that's what happens.
Right. I think the big issue is that so much of this activity stuff is like just circumstantial or lifestyle related or job related. Like if you have a well-paying job that requires you to sit 8 hours, then hey, what are you gonna do? Like quit your 200K per year job and go work from 60K for a manual labor job or what? Like,
of course, there's also the issue is if you are in that socioeconomic status, you can hire a trainer to come beat on you at lunch. You can hire a trainer to come beat on you at night. I saw something, and I hate this stuff, just bugs me so much. It was a business magazine, which of course is written by affluent white folks, and exercise may be better for mental health than low socioeconomic status, right? Basically, exercise is a bigger determinant than being poor. And everybody, including myself, said, here's the thing. When you have to work 3 jobs to survive, you don't have a lot of time for exercise.
Oh, yeah.
And I love the list of, here's 10 things that successful people do. Read books. Go do this. Right, because they don't have to work 16 hours a day. This did not make them successful. They can do this because they have money, right? I just, that stuff, it bugs me so much to see that stuff, because I'm like, and I just want to tell these people, I see it all the time, right? Jamie Oliver, who needs to be smacked. It's like, oh, poor people just need to go to the farmer's market. All right, dude, I want you to get on the dole or go work a minimum wage job 16 hours a day. Show me. That's the reality show I want to see. Show me that you can afford rent, bills, basic necessities of living, and go pay for food at the farmer's market. Prove to me, like, it would be such a wake-up call for these assholes to have to. Somebody did it. A friend of mine told me this story, and it was this couple. She was like extremist vegan gluten. He was whatever, and they were going to prove that it could be done. They were going to prove that you could be on maintenance, like a low-paying job, and do this for a month. And one weekend they were starving to death because they were out of money. Because she was buying food that was triple. People want to go, Just don't buy. Look, when you can get McDonald's fries and a drink for $1.39 and get 1,000 calories, you do not get, because that's all the money you have. You don't get to afford salad, right? You don't. It's ridiculous. Anyway, so yes, I think there's a huge socioeconomic factor, but it can go both directions, right? It can go if you have a super high paying job that means you have to sit in front of a computer. Well, that's your life, but you probably have the freedom to go to the gym or have a trainer. If you're very poor, you may actually have a very, depending on where you work, like I'm in Texas. We have a lot of manual laborers. You know what? They seem to do all right, staying in shape, even regardless of diet, but they're hauling lumber and putting up fences and roofing and doing all that 8 hours a day. And then there's this happy middle ground that may be almost in some way, but if you're poor, you don't have a lot of money and you may be eating a lot of high calorie, high palatable food because that's what's there and that's what you've been raised on. And so, yeah, I think his model is interesting. I think it absolutely has some validity at the higher levels, but even his own speculative model is like up to I don't think, I agree with him. I don't think that physical activity shows a linear increase with total energy expenditure. You start eating more, you get hungrier, especially if you get leaner. He even said in that paper briefly, body fat percentage and other things play a role, right? There's even papers, the exercise hunger thing. In general, in overweight individuals, not a big effect, but there's huge variability. When you get leaner, suddenly that often stops happening, right? When you're leaner, you're hungry all the time, and exercise may vary because it's having hormonal effects that want to make you not starve to death. So like you've got a lot of different variables, and there is still that potential for genetic set point that won't surprise me in the least if it exists.
I grew up in a small village, and even to this point, I'm in Romania, and people like to bring up these nostalgic ideas that that my grandparents, they used to eat like this lard. We have this traditional food, like it's basically just pure fat, and just you smoke it, and it's kind of like bacon, but it's even more fat and just not basically just fat and no meat. And they ate like a ton of bread and these high fat salamis and stuff like that. And basically their whole point was, but my grandparents used to eat like this many, exactly like this many calories, and they were all healthy and this and that. And I'm like, yeah, because they woke up at like 5 a.m. and they went out to the field and they worked like mad till noon when their wife came out to the field and brought their bucket of food, and they ate, and then they started took like 30 minutes off, and then they worked again till like 7 in the evening, and then they got home and ate again and went to sleep, and the next day got up at 5 and repeated the whole process. Like, of course they were lean.
Yes, and we've got that here too. Everyone is just like, oh, our grandparents ate 80% fat and all these calories and all this stuff's like, right, and they worked in the mines and they labored all day and all this stuff, and it's like you can't make it. It's so dumb. So yeah, yes, people just keep forgetting, even with evolutionary stuff. It's like we live in a completely different environment. So whatever. I think, like I said, I think there's merit to both models. Certainly, I think I don't see that they necessarily contradict one another, because Pontzer, I don't think, is saying that any increase in physical activity will cause a constraint to bring it back to baseline. But above a certain point, you probably, and I think that's just the real world.
Yeah, what I don't like about that message, and I think he mentioned this, that he doesn't want this to be taken as, well, you might even just not bother exercising, because he said that exercise still has a ton of benefits. It's just that for the sake of energy expenditure, I guess it's not the best, which I agree that it's easier to control what you eat, or easier to create a deficit that way.
Yeah, no, and I certainly don't disagree with that. Like, if he's falling into the Taubes trap, I think, and Taubes has said that. It was like, oh, exercise doesn't work because you just eat more. Yeah, and if you actually look at the studies, your appetite on average, does not increase food intake to the point that it offsets the exercise. It certainly reduces the deficit, and in some people, some people do gain and do gain weight when it happens. But again, we're looking at an uncontrolled diet situation, and this idea that exercise does nothing, it changes the composition of what's lost over time, that all that stuff. So the conclusion that, adding exercise, because the studies don't show that. They just don't. They show that up to a point, adding so many calories of exercise does increase total energy expenditure by about that much. If you go above that, there's an adaptation, but it's still not sufficient to offset the increase. You still get a net increase. I don't think I've ever seen anything showing that it becomes completely flat, because I don't think it's possible. If you're capable of doing 1,000 calories of exercise, which means you're super fit and training super hard, I would love to see the paper that shows that some other component of your of energy expenditure decreases by 1,000 calories. And it doesn't, because it doesn't exist. If anything happens, your food intake might go up, whether consciously or unconsciously. I would love to see that study.
I just use myself as an example. Like, memory came up like from I think 2 or 3 years ago when I was proud when I got like 50,000 steps in a week. Like, I know how much I was eating. I was cutting on 2,400 calories maybe, and now I'm at 20,000, and I can probably eat at 3,000, 3,200 and be in a deficit. So there you go, 6, 7, 800 calorie difference. I mean, that's just activity.
Yeah, and like I said, it's NEAT is really where the difference. Yeah, and I taught. You will see differences that magnitude in like mainly endurance athletes. Like an endurance cyclist might do an hour spin, or they might do a 5-hour ride with intervals. You will see some pretty significant daily shifts, but that's a formal activity thing, and that's just got to do with their training sequence. There's one case study I talked about in the women's book, and we could probably move on. And it was Louise Burke in the AIS. And Louise Burke is this amazing researcher, sports nutritionist. She's who I want to be when I grow up. She's just phenomenal. And they did a case study. It was a female cyclist that got hurt and lost a lot of, lost some muscle, gained body fat, and then she needed to get back into shape for her competition season. And they did everything right. She was actually on like 1.6 grams per pound of protein, like 3.5 grams per kilo, like more than even I would recommend. They put her on, she targeted a moderate deficit of like whatever her energy availability was. She made sure and had, a couple more servings of protein, some dairy protein after her hard workout. She did low intensity stuff fasted. Let's not get into that. She did on the harder workout. She did, around workout nutrition. She had some protein at bedtime. Like I said, Louise Burke, she's got it. She knows her stuff. And what you saw was her calorie intake was really high for a fairly small cyclist, but towards the end of her training, she was doing 2 5-hour bike rides a week on top of, 4 other days of training, weights twice a week. And I'm like, right, when you do that, your calorie expenditure can be super, like, I'm sure on those training days, 3,500 calories or 3,000 calories was probably her deficit. Like, that was her deficit day. Like, she was probably still in a deficit. But when you're burning, at the low end, 2,000 calories in a 5-hour workout, yeah, you get to eat all the food and still be dieting. It's just most people can't do that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's just reality. I mean, people, the grass is always greener on the other side. Like, people have a high-paying job. They want to be that guy who is like active all day. But when you're active all day, usually it means that, it usually either means that you are unemployed, or you are young, or you usually have some sort of low-paying job, because most high-paying jobs are usually doesn't involve you running on your feet all day. So.
Oh yes, yeah, agreed, absolutely.
And the guy who is like a pizza delivery guy or whatever he is, all he wants to do is sit in a cubicle and get a nice paying job and stay in a suit. So there is always something to complain about.
Oh sure, no, absolutely. And of course, when you deliver pizza, you get to eat pizza at the store.
Okay, so that was episode 32 of the Muscle Engineer podcast with Lyle McDonald, and it was also the part 2 of 3 of this episode I recorded with him. So look forward to the third part coming out in 2 weeks from now. Now, as usual, I wanna leave you guys with some of my own takeaways and key messages or lessons of the episode. The first of which is the pretty much established fact that there's really, outside of medical conditions, there is no such thing as a slow metabolism. Like, the reason why perhaps you are not losing weight, or the reason why you are having to consume fewer calories than someone with the similar stats, so to speak, is not because they have a faster metabolism. Now, there are, of course, some inter-individual differences, but those account to maybe 10 to 15%. So we see a 10 to 15% variation between people, which is not nothing, not zero, but it's also not the huge factor people make it out to be. So what's the reason? It's neat. It's a very neat reason to make a very bad pun. Basically, the stuff that we discussed towards the end of the episode, the occupational energy expenditure, that's what differentiates people usually. So if you see someone who is your height, your weight, but they maintain on higher calories, you can be more than certain that they probably have a job or a lifestyle that requires them or allows them to get in a high number of steps. Now, usually it's a necessity, like we mentioned there, but sometimes it's a choice. Point number 2 is on the role of activity for fat loss. And that is to say that it is absolutely helpful. There is a reason why bodybuilders do cardio, for example. It is helpful, but it's not additive necessarily. That means that if you have been, let's say, eating 3,000 calories and you stopped losing weight, if you then add in 500 calories of cardio per day, then that doesn't mean that it for sure will yield a 500 calorie deficit, because you simply might compensate by moving less, so that 500 might be more like 350. And it's not unlimited. So, and this was basically Herman Pontzer's point, that activity you can add onto your daily routine, but you cannot add unlimited amounts of it, and you cannot expect for your energy expenditure to increase linearly with that. There will be sort of a sweet spot, so you have to find the sweet spot for you where that activity that you add into your daily routine is actually worth the energy expenditure, because you simply might find that by removing the cardio, for example, you are simply have more energy to move throughout the day, and you accomplish the same thing without the mental burden of doing cardio. And the third and final point, which is more of an actionable one, is to establish a baseline for yourself. That means that you gotta have a device, usually or ideally a bracelet or something that you wear with yourself all day, because your phone, it's hopefully not with you all day, so that's not as reliable. But a watch or a bracelet, something like that, and you track your steps, and you see how many steps you take each day, and you try to standardize it. And that will be very helpful when you're trying to lose weight, when you're trying to gain weight, that kind of stuff, because it allows you to sort of control the variables and then adjust your diet as needed. And also this allows you, of course, to adjust it as needed. Meaning, let's say you've been doing 10,000 steps and now you feel like you don't really want to lower your calories further, then you can simply increase those steps to 12,000 or 15,000. Now, of course, there are practical realities with this. Like if you work 10 hours per day in an office, you probably won't have time to do this, but it is what it is. We all have our unique challenges. So these are just some ideas to play with or to think about. So I hope these were helpful. I hope you enjoyed the episode and look forward to the next one coming out as soon as possible. Take care.